The Senate hearing room was unusually crowded that Tuesday morning. Press cameras lined the back wall in 3 rows, and the gallery seats were filled 90 minutes before the scheduled start time. Word had spread through Capitol Hill that this was not going to be a routine confirmation hearing. What no one in that room knew yet was that by the time the session ended, a sitting United States senator would walk out of a hearing for the first time in his career, and the 23 seconds of silence that preceded his exit would become the most replayed moment in C-SPAN history. Jasmine Crockett arrived at 7:45, a full hour and 15 minutes early. She carried a single leather portfolio under her left arm and wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. Her heels made no sound on the marble floor as she walked past the press gaggle without acknowledging a single question. She took her seat at the far end of the committee table, opened her portfolio, and began reviewing documents with the focused attention of a surgeon preparing for a complex procedure. She did not look up when the other committee members began filing in. She did not react when the cameras started their test runs, flooding the room with harsh white light. She simply turned pages, made notes in the margins with a fountain pen, and waited. J.D. Vance entered the room at 8:27, with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. He was accompanied by 3 senior aides who carried briefing binders that would never be opened. He smiled broadly at the cameras, waved to someone in the gallery, and took his position at the witness table with the easy posture of a man on a promotional book tour rather than a confirmation hearing for a cabinet position that would control billions in federal spending. He adjusted his microphone with one hand while checking his phone with the other. When the committee chairman called the hearing to order, Vance set the phone down on the table in front of him, screen up, as if he expected to be checking it frequently. The chairman's opening remarks were standard procedural language, and Vance listened with the polite inattention of someone who had heard it all before. When it came time for his opening statement, he leaned forward into the microphone and delivered what sounded like a campaign speech rather than testimony. He spoke of bringing common sense back to Washington. He spoke of ending the era of career bureaucrats who had never built anything or signed the front of a paycheck. He spoke of his business experience, his military service, his deep understanding of what working Americans needed. His voice carried the practiced cadence of someone who had given this speech many times before, who knew exactly where the applause lines were, who expected them to land. Then he made his first mistake. When the time came for committee questions, Vance glanced down the table and registered the presence of Jasmine Crockett for what appeared to be the first time. Something in his expression shifted. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and when he looked away, there was the faintest trace of a smirk at the corner of his mouth. When the chairman recognized Crockett for her questioning period, Vance's body language changed entirely. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and fixed her with the indulgent expression of a professor preparing to tolerate a particularly slow student. Crockett adjusted her microphone and opened the first page of her portfolio. Her voice when she spoke was measured and clear. She thanked the chairman. She thanked the witness for his attendance. She noted for the record that this hearing concerned his nomination to serve as Secretary of Veterans Affairs, a position responsible for the health care, benefits, and well-being of 19 million American veterans. Then she paused, looked directly at Vance, and asked her first question. How many years had he spent working directly with veterans' healthcare systems? Vance uncrossed his arms and leaned forward slightly. His tone carried the patronizing warmth of someone explaining something obvious to someone uninformed. He had, he said, served his country in the Marine Corps. He had commanded men in combat. He understood sacrifice and service in ways that perhaps not everyone on this committee could fully appreciate. He let that last phrase hang in the air for a moment. The implication was clear and intended to be heard. Then he delivered the line that would define everything that followed. He said he understood that the Congresswoman was relatively new to federal service and perhaps still learning how these processes worked, but he wanted to assure her that his military experience provided him with all the relevant background necessary for this position. He emphasized the word new in a way that made it clear he meant young. He emphasized the word learning in a way that made it clear he meant unprepared. Then he smiled at her the way a parent smiles at a child who is asked why the sky is blue. Jasmine Crockett's expression did not change. She did not react to the tone. She did not respond to the condescension. She simply made a note on the page in front of her with her fountain pen, the scratch of ink on paper audible in the microphones. Then she looked up and thanked Senator Vance for that answer. She had, she said, just a few follow-up questions. She opened the portfolio fully and removed a document printed on official letterhead. She held it at an angle that allowed the cameras to capture the visible stamps and signature lines. This was, she explained, a report from the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General dated April 7th of the previous year. The report concerned a private healthcare company called Valor Health Systems. Senator Vance was familiar with Valor Health Systems, was he not? Vance's confident posture held, but something in his eyes changed. He knew the name, he said. They were one of many private contractors who worked with the VA to provide supplemental services. It was a public-private partnership model he strongly supported. Crockett nodded slowly. She appreciated that answer, she said, because it gave her the opportunity to provide some additional context. She turned to page 12 of the IG report and read aloud. Valor Health Systems had been awarded $280 million in VA contracts between 2018 and 2022. During that same period, the company had been cited for 73 separate violations of patient care standards. 17 veterans had died while under Valor's care in circumstances that the Inspector General classified as preventable with proper oversight. She set the report down gently and asked Senator Vance if he recalled those 17 deaths. Vance shifted in his chair. His tone remained confident but had acquired a slight edge. Tragic outcomes, he said, occurred in any healthcare system. What mattered was improving the system overall, which was exactly what he intended to do if confirmed. Crockett thanked him for that perspective. Then she opened a second folder. This folder, she explained, contained financial disclosure documents that Senator Vance had filed as required by law. These were public records, available to anyone who requested them. She had requested them 6 weeks earlier. She had spent considerable time reviewing them. And she had noticed something interesting. Between 2019 and 2021, Senator Vance had held equity positions in 3 separate investment funds. One of those funds had held a significant stake in Valor Health Systems. The exact amount of Senator Vance's profit from that investment was not disclosed in dollar terms, but the filing indicated that the investment had been sold in late 2021 for a return classified as between $1 million and $5 million. She looked up from the document. Her expression was not accusatory. It was simply attentive, the way a researcher looks at data. Could Senator Vance confirm that timeline? The room had gone completely silent. The typing in the press gallery had stopped. Vance uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. His voice had lost its patronizing warmth. These were standard investment vehicles, he said, managed funds. He did not personally select individual companies. These were broad healthcare sector investments recommended by his financial advisors, and everything had been properly disclosed according to Senate ethics rules. Crockett nodded. She appreciated that clarification, she said. She wanted to make sure she understood the timeline correctly. So Senator Vance had been a passive investor in a fund that held Valor stock. That fund had profited during the exact period when Valor was receiving hundreds of millions in VA contracts. And Senator Vance had sold that position in late 2021, the same year the IG investigation became public. She paused and asked if she had the sequence of events correct. Vance's jaw tightened visibly. The investments were legal, he said. They were disclosed, and he resented the implication that there was anything improper about a senator participating in the same investment opportunities available to any American citizen. Crockett closed the second folder and set it aside. Something in her tone shifted. It became quieter, more precise. She said she was not making implications. She was simply reading from official documents. But since Senator Vance had raised the question of what was available to any American citizen, she wanted to introduce someone who might have a different perspective on that. She turned to the gallery and nodded once. A woman in her mid-60s stood from the third row. She wore a blue cardigan and held a folded American flag in her hands. Her name was Patricia Simmons. Her husband, Staff Sergeant David Simmons, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He had come home in 2019 with shrapnel wounds and traumatic brain injury. The VA had referred him to Valor Health Systems for specialized neurological care because the nearest VA facility with that capability was 200 miles from their home in rural Kentucky. Patricia Simmons walked slowly to the witness microphone that had been set up for public testimony. She did not read from notes. She simply spoke. Her husband's first appointment at Valor had been scheduled for 6 weeks after his referral. When the day came, the specialist was not available. The appointment was rescheduled. It was rescheduled again. In the 4 months between his referral and his first actual appointment, David Simmons's condition deteriorated. He began experiencing severe headaches. He lost the ability to sleep more than 2 hours at a time. On January 14, 2020, he took his own life in the garage of their home while Patricia was at the grocery store. The Inspector General's report classified his death as preventable with timely specialist intervention. Patricia Simmons held up the folded flag. This, she said, was what the Marine Corps had given her at David's funeral. She wanted to know what Senator Vance's investment fund had given the families of the 17 veterans who died under Valor's care. The silence that followed was absolute. No one in the gallery moved. The cameras did not adjust. Vance stared at the table in front of him, his face drained of color. Crockett allowed the silence to hold for a full 10 seconds before she spoke again. Her voice was gentle. She thanked Mrs. Simmons for her testimony and for her husband's service. Then she turned back to Senator Vance. She had, she said, just one or two more questions. She opened a third folder. This one was thicker than the others and held together with a black binder clip. These documents, she explained, were transcripts from 3 separate Senate Armed Services Committee hearings held in 2020, 2021, and 2022. In all 3 hearings, members of the committee had raised concerns about private contractor performance in the VA system. In all 3 hearings, Senator Vance had been present. She turned to a highlighted section and read aloud. In the 2020 hearing, Senator Elizabeth Warren had introduced an amendment that would have required enhanced oversight of private VA contractors and mandatory reporting of patient safety incidents. The amendment had failed by a vote of 51 to 49. Senator Vance had voted against it. In the 2021 hearing, Senator John Tester had introduced similar language requiring that contractors meet minimum patient-to-staff ratios and maximum wait times for specialist appointments. That amendment had also failed. Senator Vance had voted against it. In the 2022 hearing, after the Inspector General's report had become public, but before it had received widespread press attention, Senator Tammy Duckworth had introduced emergency language to suspend contracts with any provider cited for more than 10 patient safety violations pending investigation. Senator Vance had voted against that measure as well. Crockett set the transcript pages down and looked at Vance directly. She asked if his memory of those votes aligned with the official record. Vance's hands were gripping the edge of the witness table. Those votes, he said, had been about preventing government overreach into the private sector. They had been about preserving flexibility and choice for veterans. They had nothing to do with any individual company. Crockett opened a 4th folder. Her movements were unhurried, almost meditative. This folder contained letters, 73 of them. Each letter had been sent to Senator Vance's office by veterans or veterans' families between 2019 and 2022. The letters described problems with private VA contractors, delayed appointments, denied treatments, facilities that were understaffed or unsanitary. Several of the letters specifically mentioned Valor Health Systems by name. Every letter had received the same response. A form letter thanking the constituent for their input and assuring them that Senator Vance remained committed to expanding veterans' access to private healthcare options. Crockett selected one letter and held it up. This one was from a woman in Ohio whose father had waited 9 weeks for a cardiology appointment at a Valor facility. He had died of a heart attack 6 days before the appointment date. The woman's letter asked Senator Vance to please look into the company's practices. It was dated March 2020. The form response was dated April 2020. It thanked her for her concern and encouraged her to explore the many private healthcare options now available to veterans through the Expanded Choice Program. Crockett set the letter down. She asked Senator Vance if his office had ever conducted the investigation this constituent had requested. Vance's voice when he answered was tight. Senate offices received thousands of letters. Staff handled constituent correspondence according to standard protocols. He could not personally investigate every complaint that came through the office. Crockett nodded slowly. She understood that, she said. Senate offices were busy places. Senators had many responsibilities, which brought her to her final question. She closed all 4 folders and stacked them neatly in front of her. Then she folded her hands on top of the stack and looked directly at Senator Vance. In his opening statement, he had spoken about bringing common sense to Washington. He had spoken about understanding what working Americans needed. He had questioned whether everyone on this committee truly understood sacrifice and service. He had suggested that perhaps some members were too new, too inexperienced, to fully grasp these complex issues. So she wanted to ask him something simple. Between 2018 and 2022, how much time had he personally spent visiting VA facilities? Not campaign events at VA hospitals, not photo opportunities with veterans groups, actual time spent observing patient care, talking to frontline providers, reviewing facility operations. How many hours? The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one had weight. It pressed down on the room like a physical force. Vance opened his mouth. No sound came out. He closed it again. His eyes moved to his aides in the seats behind him, but they were looking at their hands. 5 seconds. 10. 15. 20. Someone in the press gallery coughed, and the sound was startling in the absolute quiet. 23 seconds. Finally, Vance cleared his throat. He said, visited numerous facilities. He could not recall the exact number. His schedule had been demanding, but his commitment to veterans was unwavering. Crockett's expression did not change. She simply reached for the portfolio one more time and removed a final document. This one was a calendar log from the VA Office of Public Affairs. It tracked all official congressional visits to VA medical facilities. The log was public record, maintained to ensure transparency about legislative oversight. According to the log, Senator Vance had made 0 official visits to any VA facility between January 2018 and December 2022, 0 hours. She set the calendar log on top of the folders. The sound of paper meeting paper seemed impossibly loud. She had one more document to share, she said. This one was not from a government agency. It was a screenshot from Senator Vance's own social media account, posted in August 2021. In the post, Senator Vance stood in front of a private aircraft at a small regional airport. The caption read, "Another week, another city, building the future of American business." The post had been tagged with the location, a private equity conference in Aspen, Colorado. The post was dated August 19, 2021. The Inspector General's report on Valor Health Systems had been delivered to the Senate Armed Services Committee on August 16, 2021. Crockett looked up from the screenshot. She asked Senator Vance if he had read the Inspector General's report before voting against Senator Duckworth's amendment that October. Vance's face had gone from pale to red. His voice when he finally spoke was loud enough that the sound technicians had to adjust levels. He said he had reviewed all relevant materials provided by committee staff. He said his votes were based on principle, not politics. He said he had devoted his entire adult life to serving his country, and he would not sit here and be lectured about veterans' issues by someone who had never worn the uniform, who had been in Congress for less than one term, who did not understand how the real world worked. He was nearly shouting by the end of it. Crockett waited until he finished. Then she responded in a voice that had not changed in volume or tone since the hearing began. She said she appreciated Senator Vance's passion on this issue, but since he had raised the question of understanding how things worked, she wanted to clarify something for the record. She had spent 6 years as a civil rights attorney before entering Congress. During those 6 years, she had represented 43 veterans in disability claims cases against the VA. She had won 38 of those cases. She had recovered over $11 million in wrongfully denied benefits for veterans and their families. She had spent hundreds of hours in VA facilities, in claims offices, in appeals hearings. She had sat with veterans in hospital rooms while they waited for appointments that had been delayed. She had held the hands of widows who were being told their husbands' service-connected illnesses did not qualify for survivor benefits. So while she had never worn the uniform, she had spent considerable time serving those who had. She paused and let that settle. Then she returned to her question. Had Senator Vance read the Inspector General's report before voting against the oversight amendments? Vance's hands were shaking visibly now. He pushed back from the table and stood. His microphone fell forward with a sharp crack. He said he did not have to sit here and justify his record to anyone. He had been invited to this hearing in good faith, and he was being subjected to a partisan ambush. This was exactly what was wrong with Washington. This was exactly the kind of political theater that real Americans were sick of. He turned to leave. Crockett's voice stopped him before he reached the door. She had not asked him to justify his record, she said. She had simply asked if he had read a report. It was a yes or no question. Vance stood with his hand on the door handle. The cameras captured his profile perfectly. His jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. For a moment, it seemed he might answer. Then he pushed through the door and disappeared into the hallway beyond. The hearing room remained silent for several seconds after he left. Then the press gallery erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Camera operators scrambled for position. The chairman gavelled for order, but it took nearly 2 minutes to restore quiet. When the room finally settled, Jasmine Crockett gathered her folders and placed them back in her portfolio. She closed it with a soft leather snap. Then she looked directly into the center camera and delivered her final statement. This hearing, she said, was not about partisan politics. It was not about personal attacks. It was about a simple principle. The men and women who wore the uniform of the United States deserved leaders who would fight for them as hard as they had fought for this country. They deserved leaders who did their homework, leaders who read the reports, leaders who visited the facilities, Leaders who remembered that public service meant serving the public, not profiting from it. When Senator Vance had walked into this room 4 hours earlier, he had questioned her qualifications. He had suggested she was too new to understand how things worked, but she had not come here to prove her qualifications to him. She had come here to do the job the people of her district had sent her to do, and that job was to ask the questions that needed to be asked, to demand the answers that needed to be given, and to make sure that the 17 veterans who died under Valor's care, and the thousands more who deserved better, were not forgotten in the rush to confirm another nominee who had not done the work. She thanked the chairman. She thanked Mrs. Simmons for her testimony and her courage. And she entered into the record all 4 folders of documents: the Inspector General's report, the financial disclosures, the committee transcripts, the constituent letters, and the visitation log. Then she stood, collected her portfolio, and walked out of the hearing room with the same measured pace she had entered with 5 hours earlier. The nomination was withdrawn 2 days later. The 23-second silence became the most watched clip in C-SPAN history, surpassing 12 million views in the first 72 hours. It was shared across every platform, referenced in editorials, played on news programs in 15 countries. Patricia Simmons was interviewed by 3 major networks and received personal calls from 4 sitting senators who had never responded to her letters. The Inspector General launched an expanded investigation into 7 additional private VA contractors. 3 companies lost their contracts within 6 months. Congressional oversight requirements were strengthened in the following year's National Defense Authorization Act. The amendment was sponsored by Senator Tammy Duckworth and co-sponsored by 6 Republicans who had previously voted against similar measures. And in the small office that Jasmine Crockett maintained in a converted warehouse in South Dallas, a folded American flag sat on the corner of her desk. It had been sent to her by Patricia Simmons with a note that read simply, "Thank you for asking the questions. Thank you for doing the homework. David would have appreciated knowing someone finally did." The flag remained there through the rest of her term. She never mentioned it in speeches or interviews, but everyone who visited that office saw it, and everyone who saw it understood what it meant. Some questions have to be asked, some homework has to be done, and sometimes the youngest person in the room is the only one who bothered to prepare.